Welcome to Economy and World. They say that those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it. Today we are going to discover why the present of modern powers resembles, in a haunting way, the past of empires that ended in ruins. Imagine for a moment walking through a city that seems impossible to destroy. It is the year 400 AD, and you are in the heart of Rome. Around you, colossal stone buildings defy time, with an arrogance that only absolute power can afford. The aqueducts continue to carry water like eternal veins, feeding fountains and baths in a ceaseless flow that seems to have no end. The Colosseum stands on the horizon as a symbol of total authority, capable of gathering tens of thousands of people under a single cry, a single emotion, a single destiny. Everything you see, everything you touch, conveys a single idea, a certainty shared by both the noble and the slave. This can never end. Rome is not just a city. It is the center of the known world, the sun around which land, seas, and peoples of 3 continents revolve. It has survived civil wars, palace betrayals, plagues, and external enemies for centuries. For those living there, Rome is not a stage of history. It is history itself, the natural order of things. Now perform an additional exercise of imagination. Imagine you approach any Roman citizen, someone walking with the confidence of one who knows they are protected by the deadliest legions on the planet. You tap them on the shoulder and tell them that, in less than a century, everything they see, the marble columns, the vibrant markets, the efficient bureaucracy, will be abandonment, ruins, and silence. That the most powerful empire ever built will simply disappear. That man would not listen to you intently. He would laugh. He would think you are delusional, that you have lost your mind. Because empires, when they are at the top, always believe the same thing, that the laws of historical gravity do not apply to them. Fast forward to the present. Stand mentally in Times Square, in the heart of New York City. Look at the steel and glass towers that pierce the sky, the giant screens that never sleep, bombarding information and consumption 24 hours a day. Observe the numbers rising and falling on financial market panels, deciding the fate of entire nations with the stroke of an algorithm. Think of the most sophisticated military machinery that has ever existed, patrolling every ocean and monitoring every corner of the globe from space. Now ask the same uncomfortable question. What if this empire wasn't eternal either? If today someone were to claim, backed by data, that the foundations of American power are entering a phase of irreversible breakdown, the social reaction would be almost identical to that of the Roman 1600 years ago. Denial, ridicule, absolute certainty. We are told the system is too big to fail, that technology makes us different, that our institutions are too solid. But history has never been a sequence of isolated accidents. It is a pattern. It is a cycle that repeats over and over again, driven by a constant that never changes, something etched into our nature, the human condition. We are not an exception to the rule. We are only the most recent chapter of a very ancient story. And all cycles, without exception, have an end. The fall of great empires rarely happens suddenly, like a lightning bolt in a clear sky. There is no single day marked in red on the calendar where everything collapses at once. What does exist is a slow process, a gradual erosion, almost invisible while it happens, but painfully obvious when observed in retrospect. History does not move in a straight line toward infinite progress. It moves in circles. Over and over again, we see the same path. A society is born with solid values of effort and discipline, expands through sacrifice, reaches extraordinary power, and, once at the top, convinced of its own invulnerability, begins to break the very rules that brought it there. It doesn't happen because that society suddenly becomes evil, but because its leaders begin to believe that this time is different. It never is. What is truly unsettling about the collapse of the Roman Empire is not that it happened, but how familiar its process feels when compared to today. We are not talking about poetic analogies. The parallels are concrete, measurable, and deeply uncomfortable. We are talking about economic indicators, social tensions, and cultural transformations that seem carbon copied. Rome was not defeated overnight by barbarian hordes. Those invaders were only the final blow to a body that was already dying. Rome weakened from within in a way that was almost imperceptible to those living at the time. It made a specific mistake that acted like acid corroding the empire's foundations until it was unable to support its own weight. That mistake had a name, and it had consequences that we are replicating today with alarming precision. Today, the United States is following the exact same path, not symbolically, but literally. It is repeating the same pattern of expansion, excess, and degradation, only it is doing so in less time and on a much larger global scale. The symptoms are identical, and when looking at the complete timeline of history's great empires, a fact emerges that is impossible to ignore. Most global superpowers have a surprisingly similar lifespan, around 250 years before undergoing a deep crisis that redefines the entire system. The United States is dangerously approaching that chronological point. The year 2026 is not a date chosen at random. It marks the 250th anniversary of the country's birth. It is a number that, when placed within the context of comparative history, eerily coincides with the moment when other empires began their phase of definitive breakdown. This is not an analysis of the past as something distant. It is a warning, because to understand where we are going, we first have to understand how it all began. We have to go back to the origin of Rome before its decadence, when it was still strong, austere, and apparently incorruptible. Rome was not born as a decadent empire. During its first centuries, especially in the Republic stage, it was a society built on values of iron discipline. Romans of that time saw themselves as citizens rather than individuals with unlimited rights. They were, for the most part, farmers who worked their own land. When the Republic required it, those same men left the plow, took up arms, defended their territory, and returned to their fields. They did not fight for infinite wealth. They fought out of duty. There was a very strong idea of sacrifice, austerity, and shared responsibility. This mentality was transparently reflected in their economy. For centuries, the heart of the system was the denarius. It was not an abstract symbol or a promise on paper. It was a piece of real silver with an almost pure metal content. Its value did not depend on trust in a ruler, but on the metal itself. To hold a denarius was to hold tangible wealth. This generated stability, allowed for saving without fear, and long-term planning. The economy worked because money represented something real. There were no shortcuts. Growth was backed by real production and concrete resources. But as with all great successes, that very stability sowed the seeds of decadence. By conquering new territories, enormous amounts of wealth flowed to the capital. But that abundance transformed society. The ruling class turned into an urban elite, immensely wealthy and detached from productive life. The focus was no longer on creating, but on consuming. When the Republic gave way to the Empire, this process accelerated. The territory was immense, and maintaining it had an astronomical maintenance cost. Permanent legions, expensive infrastructure, and, above all, the need to support the capital's population. To prevent revolts from an impoverished and idle mass, emperors implemented the famous bread and circus policies, free distribution of grain and massive spectacles. It worked politically, but it was incredibly expensive. A point came when the resources from conquests were not enough. There were no new lands to loot. Rome entered a familiar situation, systematically spending more than it brought in. Deficits became the norm. Faced with this, leaders faced a crossroads. Reduce spending, unpopular. and dangerous, or increase taxes, which would destroy production. They chose the third path, currency manipulation. In the mid-1st century, under the reign of Nero, monetary degradation began. The government collected pure silver coins, melted them down, and mixed them with cheap metals like copper. Then they minted them again with the same face value. In appearance, nothing had changed. In practice, it was a lie. The state was creating money out of thin air to pay its debts, transferring the citizens' wealth to the public coffers. It was the birth of Roman inflation. It didn't arrive as an explosion, but as a slow poison. Each new emperor repeated the process. What started with a 5% reduction ended decades later with coins that were basically copper with a silver wash. The consequence was inevitable. Prices rose, savings vanished, and trust evaporated. Merchants stopped selling, and long-distance trade halted. The state became authoritarian, imposing price controls that only made things worse. The army, paid with worthless coins, lost loyalty. The empire did not fall to an external attack, it fell when its money died, and with it, the trust that held everything together. The United States began in a strikingly similar way. During its rise, the dollar was backed by physical gold. That discipline forced the government to be responsible. You couldn't spend what you didn't have. But after World War II, the country became a global empire with immense military and social expenses. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made the same decision as Nero. He broke the link between money and gold. The dollar became backed solely by trust. From that moment on, the brakes disappeared. Unlike Rome, the United States can create money with a click. What took the Romans centuries happened here in decades. The national debt scaled to levels mathematically impossible to pay. Trillions created out of thin air to plug holes in a system that consumes more than it generates. And the consequences are felt today in the supermarket, in rent, and in the loss of purchasing power year after year. It is the largest transfer of wealth in history, from the workers to the state and financial elites. At the same time, the social fabric is fragmenting. The gap between those who benefit from money printing and those who live off their labor is widening. Modern bread and circus, through digital entertainment and infinite consumption, keeps us distracted while the real economy empties from within. Over thousands of years, empires have followed this pattern: excessive debt, degraded currency, and loss of values. The United States, born in 1776, hits the 250-year mark in 2026. It is not a coincidence. It is the time it takes for a system to exhaust its capital. Rome's final mistake was believing economic laws didn't apply to them because they were the eternal city. The current mistake is believing that because the dollar dominates the world, it can be printed without limits. But the world is changing. Entire countries are looking for alternatives and moving away from American debt. When that money created outside is no longer accepted, it comes home in the form of massive inflation. The result is not stability, but a forced reset. Rome did not disappear in one night. What collapsed was its structure and its security. Those who understood the cycle had room to adapt. History always leaves us the same message. The collapse of a model based on monetary deception cannot be avoided, but it can be anticipated. The question is not whether the reset will arrive, because the change is already happening. The question is whether you will be awake and prepared when the cycle completes its turn. The clock of history does not stop. The final act has already begun.